Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Nala Huda dalam Fokus Minggu Depan. Dan selepas kemenangan Parti Buruh bawah pimpinan Anthony Albanese dalam pilihan raya Australia semalam, kami akan terus bawakan perkembangan politik di Australia, terutamanya menjelang pembentukan kerajaan Baharu pada minggu depan yang kita menjangkakan akan mengangkat sumpah seawal esok. Dan bagi penonton Astro AWANI, menarik untuk kita ikuti perkembangan ini apabila isu-isu yang diketengahkan juga relevan buat rakyat Malaysia. Antaranya seperti isu kenaikan kos sara hidup dan isu perubahan iklim atau climate change. Dan juga menarik apabila Penny Wong, anak kelahiran Kota Kinabalu, dijangka mengangkat sumpah sebagai Menteri Luar Australia pada Isnin. Dan Perdana Menteri Baharu Anthony Albanese sudah pun menyatakan minatnya untuk mengeratkan lagi hubungan bersama negara-negara Pasifik. Jadi, apa yang boleh kita jangkakan daripada kerajaan Parti Buruh selepas ini atau Labour Party? Sudah bersedia bersama saya Max Walden, wartawan ABC News Australia langsung dari sana. Terima kasih kepada Max. Thank you, Max, for joining me today to speak about the election results yesterday and what's to come in the next few days. Max, firstly, what message is being sent by the Australian voters in this election? For one, we're seeing climate change as one of the prominent issues during this election cycle, but overall, what can we make of the results?
Yeah, well, it's certainly an historic result. You've got pretty much the lowest primary vote for both the Labor and Liberal parties, which are the major, mainstream parties here in Australia. It's probably worth explaining that Australia has preferential voting. So unlike Malaysia, which has first past the post, here basically we have the parties you get the minor parties can potentially get into Parliament. So in this case, you've got Albo basically trying to form a government with some other minor parties as well.
Speaking about the minor parties, do we know at this point if the Labour Party can secure a majority in Parliament? What exactly is the process? What can we expect in the coming days?
Yeah, so it's not official, the results yet. We still will probably have to wait a few days because there's been a record number of postal votes. 2.7 million, I think, came in before Sunday. Yesterday was polling day. So Saturday rather. So yes, we'll probably have to wait. It's unclear yet whether Labor will be able to form a majority government or a minority government. But certainly, yes, these independents that are big on climate change and indeed a few more Greens MPs will really push the government to be a bit more ambitious in its climate targets.
Speaking about its climate targets, overall, what can we expect from a Labour government under Anthony Albanese?
Yeah, so both the Labor and the Liberal Party had aimed for net zero by 2050. That's obviously not as ambitious as a lot of the scientists or activists would want. Now, again, this interesting factor of having all of these record numbers of independents and sitting on the crossbench, who their main platform is on basically climate change, and indeed more House of Reps members from the Greens, in order to, I guess, pass legislation or potentially even form government, it does seem as though the Labor Party will have to make, some compromises and negotiation with these minor parties, and indeed that could see its climate platform become indeed more ambitious and see more ambitious target than net zero by 2050.
Apart from climate policy, another issue that would be interesting for the Malaysian audience, especially with the coming general election in Malaysia, expecting in the months to come, is also the issue of the rising living costs that we see as one of the main issues during the Australian election. So what can we expect from the Labour government with regards to the issue of living costs?
Yeah, so I think that's really been a focus of their campaign. I guess the outgoing government had made the argument that it was the sort of better economic managers. I suppose, conservative governments around the world often make this argument. But the Labor Party was sort of making the argument that that real wages have not been going up in Australia, and indeed, inflation in a lot of countries around the world, including Australia and Malaysia, of course, has been going up. But inflation has been going up at a significantly greater rate than wages here in Australia. And I suppose the Labor Party has, more openly committed to doing something about that. And indeed, on a range of other kind of, I suppose, things we associate with social democratic parties, like investment in health, education, these sorts of things. Indeed, there's the hope that this will help on cost of living pressures, as well as things like, say, childcare, which has been promised as universal. So I think, it does seem as though, I suppose, Australian voters have bought that argument that, under sort of a more social democratic party, cost of living will be a little bit eased.
Also interesting for the Malaysian audience is looking at Malaysian-born Penny Wong, who is expected to be sworn in as Foreign Minister on Monday. And also interesting to look at is Sam Lim as MP of Tangi, also from Malaysia, I believe born and raised in Johor. This obviously raises a whole different question about the issue of brain drain in Malaysia and why Malaysians had to migrate to other countries. That's a whole other conversation. But just looking at these Malaysian-born talents, elected representatives now, also interesting to look at. What do we know about Penny Wong and also Sam Lim?
So I guess in the case of Penny Wong, she's a very experienced politician. She's been in government before, under the Rudd and Gillard government, and she's now served as Australia's shadow foreign minister in opposition for quite some time. So yes, she's Malaysian-born, but she's very, Australian. I believe she's lived in Australia since at least she was in school. As you hear her speak, she's obviously very Aussie. But of course, her upbringing and her background inform her view of the region. And I believe, I'll leave it to Malaysian audiences to decide, but my feeling is that obviously she's the first ethnically Asian foreign minister that Australia has had, particularly being, I guess, from a Southeast Asian background. One would assume that this will be viewed positively within the region. Of course, there are sometimes perceptions of Australia that are not so positive, and so I guess this, it is hoped will kind of present a really positive view to the region. In the case of Sam Lim, I don't know all that much. I hadn't heard of him until he won this seat. Although he is a very interesting fellow, I believe he speaks 9 languages. I saw his acceptance speech where he talked about growing up in Malaysia and being very poor and, as a child sort of sleeping on a dirt floor, and then being able to kind of, make something of himself and being so proud of himself that he's kind of become, a successful representative in Australian Parliament. Of note as well is that he's a dolphin trainer. He also talked about in his acceptance speech about how lovely dolphins are and how they engage with human beings. So yeah, he's definitely an interesting guy. I can't really say much more than that. I suppose we'll just have to keep a close eye on what he actually does in Parliament.
Now, as you said about Penny Wong, surely playing the role as foreign minister will be viewed positively in the region, but we want to talk about the Labour Party's foreign policy specifically, because we also know Anthony Albanese has also stated his interest in improving ties with Pacific countries and also Indonesia in particular. So what can we make of the new government's direction in foreign policy, particularly on Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so I guess significantly, as you mentioned, some of these new ministers, including Penny Wong, will be signed in on Monday, and that's really because this week Mr. Albanese will be going to Tokyo to meet this so-called Quad grouping of, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, which is not openly, but I think everyone knows is sort of as a grouping to kind of offset the influence of China in the Asia Pacific. Now, that's his first visit, of course. That's quite a big deal. He'll present himself to, US President Joe Biden and the leaders of Japan and India. But he has also said that if he had the choice, he'd love to visit Indonesia. He's visited there before, previously as an infrastructure minister. And I think most importantly, perhaps, is the fact that Labor has committed to investing almost $500 million in renewed aid to Southeast Asia. So I guess under the previous government, quite a lot of foreign aid was redirected away from Southeast Asia towards Pacific Island nations. Indonesia used to be the largest recipient of Australian aid. It's now Papua New Guinea. So I can't really see the aid to the Pacific being cut, but certainly this is sort of a reinstatement of some of those sort of aid relationships, and also I guess, there will be, I suppose, along with that, attempts to create more people-to-people and economic ties as well.
Beyond Indo-Pacific, everybody's surely going to be looking at Australia's relationship with China. What do we know about the Labor Party's stance on China?
Well, historically, foreign policy in Australia is supposed to be bipartisan. So, I would say that even though during the campaign there have been some attempts to sort of paint the Labor Party as the preferred party of government for the Chinese Communist Party, I think it's probably fair to say that both sides of politics, whoever's in government would likely be, having a difficult relationship with Beijing. This has been acknowledged today. I saw, the incoming Deputy Prime Minister discussing the fact that, whoever's sitting there will have quite a difficult, challenging time dealing with China, because, of course, it is Australia's largest trading partner. But, for your audiences, I won't give a potted history, but the last few years have been very difficult between Australia and China on a range of issues. So indeed, yes, I think probably regardless of who won, that will be a difficult relationship to manage. So I suppose perhaps that's why Australia, under the Labor Party, will be looking to kind of Southeast Asia to build some of those partnerships as well, and I guess diversify Australia's trade relationships too, so we're not so reliant on China.
Yeah. Max, we just have about a minute left. We've talked about the climate policy, we've talked about the rising living of costs in Australia, but I think it's also important to talk about the immigration and refugee policy in Australia. Where did the parties stand on migration during the campaigns?
So the Liberal Party has long sort of been seen as the tougher party on border policy and immigration. But I would say because previously electorally Labor has sort of been punished for being sort of more lax on these issues, whether that's true or not, they have essentially kind of shadowed and in many ways replicated the policies of the Liberal Party rather. So I think it remains to be seen. The shadow Home Affairs Minister, Christina Keneally, who has sort of been quite strong on talking about the need to cut immigration to Australia, and indeed, supports a lot of the government's fairly hard-line policies on refugees. She actually did not win in the seat that she was running in. So it does remain to be seen who will become Australia's next Home Affairs Minister, or who sits in the immigration portfolio. So I think there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around, just exactly how Australia will respond to refugees and asylum seekers. But in terms of immigration overall, I think Australia will remain a fairly open, a lot of our economic growth relies on immigration, and I don't really see huge appetite from either side of politics to really drastically cut immigration. Certainly, I think this will probably be part of the strategy as Australia sort of comes out of the COVID economic difficulties.
Thank you so much for your time today, Max. Plenty more to be discussed, but unfortunately that's all the time that we have today to talk about the election results in Australia and what's to come in the next few days. Terima kasih kepada Max Walden, wartawan ABC News Australia, sedikit sebanyak kongsikan mengenai jangkaan pembentukan kerajaan baharu Australia pada minggu depan. Dan banyak lagi perkongsian selepas ini, tapi kita akan berhenti seketika, kembali selepas ini.